The aroma of dinner was still wafting through the room when Emily realized the affront. The table, meticulously set, displayed crystal glasses, impeccable china, and a meal prepared with the utmost care. But something was wrong. No place had been reserved for her. At first, she thought she had forgotten, but the exchange of glances between Patricia and Rachel soon dispelled any doubts. "I think you can eat in the kitchen, Emily," Patricia said, with a cold smile and a tone that dripped with contempt. Rachel laughed softly, while Michael, motionless at the head of the table, didn't even bother to intervene. His silence hurt as much as his mother-in-law's words. Emily felt her blood run cold, and for a moment, she was speechless. What had previously been an uncomfortable suspicion now became an overwhelming certainty. They didn't see her as part of the family. They never had. Emily took a deep breath, trying to contain the wave of humiliation and anger that threatened to overflow. It wasn't just the dinner. It wasn't just the exclusion. It was the accumulation of years of being treated like an intruder in her own home. With trembling hands, she took off her apron, dropped it on the counter, and picked up the phone. As the guests toasted in the dining room, she crossed the hallway with firm steps, dialing James's number. When he answered, his voice was firm but full of emotion. "James, I need you. Now." On the other end of the line, her brother understood immediately. Minutes later, sitting in his office, he was reviewing documents and messages that Emily had sent him. And that was when he found something that made his stomach turn. This situation was much worse than a humiliating dinner. They were trying to take away from her the only thing that really mattered: the house that her parents had left her. James wasted no time. He grabbed his car keys and headed toward the mansion, his mind racing with the discovery. The documents showed that Michael, Patricia, and Rachel had already made progress in selling the house, signing preliminary contracts and even receiving a sizable down payment. There was one problem, though. Emily's signature was essential for the transaction to go through. They evidently believed they could manipulate her into signing, or worse, forge her signature at the right time. The cynicism of the plan sickened him. Emily had spent years being belittled in that house, but this was the final blow. They didn't just want to get her out, they wanted to profit from her exit. As he pulled up in front of the mansion, James felt the weight of the moment. This night was not going to end the way they had planned. Inside the house, the party continued, oblivious to the storm that was about to break out. Patricia laughed loudly, pleased with her own wickedness, while Rachel showed off a new ring that Emily now knew had been bought with part of the money from the scam. Michael, for his part, poured himself another glass of wine, indifferent to his wife's blank look. When the door opened and James walked in, the mood changed. He didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He placed the documents on the coffee table, looking directly at Michael. "You tried to sell a house that doesn't belong to you," he said bluntly. Patricia let out an affected laugh, trying to keep her composure, but Rachel turned pale. Emily, who had been watching everything in silence until then, felt her chest burn. It was a mixture of indignation and relief. For years, she had been treated like a stranger in her own home. Now, finally, they would have to face the consequences. Michael tried to compose himself. He picked up the papers with trembling hands, flipping through them quickly as if he could find a loophole, a way to deny the truth. But it was all there, in black and white. The house legally belonged to Emily, a detail that he and his family, in their haste to pull off the coup, had ignored. Patricia was the first to lose her composure. "This is absurd," she shouted, trying to hide the fear in her voice. "It's always been Michael's dream to build a new life somewhere else. This house is old and run down. Emily has never known how to manage it." But James was unfazed. He maintained his cool and professional demeanor, letting the uncomfortable silence fill the room. He knew that, more than words, the weight of the situation was beginning to sink in on them. If they tried to go through with the sale, they could be accused of fraud. And if Emily wanted to, she could sue them for attempted embezzlement. Desperation set in quickly. Rachel was the next to speak. She tossed her hair to the side and tried to resort to cheap sentimentality. "Emily, you can't be serious. We're family." The hypocrisy almost made Emily laugh. Family? Since when? Since they made her feel invisible? Since they isolated her in their own home? Since they reduced her to a mere servant? But this time, Emily didn't stay silent. In a firm voice, she said what needed to be said. You never considered me family. You never cared about me. Now you want my house and my money? That's over. It was the first time in years she had heard herself say something like that. Without hesitation, without fear. Patricia opened her mouth to retort, but James cut her off, shoving an envelope at Michael. You have 48 hours to get out of here, or I'll take this to court. Reality hit her like a slam. Michael's face contorted, and Emily realized that for the first time he was afraid. Michael clutched the envelope in his hands, as if he could undo the situation with the strength of his fingers. His breathing was heavy, and the mask of coldness he always wore began to crack. Emily, we can talk about this, he tried, using a tone that didn't match his usual arrogance. But she wasn't willing to listen anymore. For years, she had waited for this moment, the day she would finally have control over her own life. It wasn't just about the house. It was about everything that had been done to her, about every look of disdain, every slight disguised as an innocent comment, every instance in which she had been treated like an intruder in her own home. She no longer owed anyone anything. The only conversations we'll have from now on will be through the lawyers, she replied, keeping her voice firm. The decision had been made. Patricia, who had been petrified until then, found her voice again, but now she sounded more desperate than indignant. You're throwing us out on the street, Emily, after everything we've done for you? The irony was almost comical. Emily took a deep breath, feeling a cold anger take hold of her. They really believed they were right, that they had some right over her, over the house, over her life. I've let you treat me like nothing for too long, she said, without raising her voice, but with a firmness that silenced the entire room. Now you're going to feel what it's like to be discarded. The change in attitude was immediate. Rachel, who had always behaved like the untouchable princess of the family, began to cry softly, while Michael stared at the floor, perhaps finally understanding that there was no going back. Emily didn't feel sorry. For the first time, she felt free. Rachel sobbed dramatically, trying to get someone to feel sorry for her, but no one seemed to care. Not even Michael, who usually gave in to his sister's every whim, seemed willing to console her now. He was paralyzed, not knowing how to react to the imminent fall. Patricia, for her part, alternated between anger and panic. This can't be happening. This can't be happening, she repeated, as if it were a nightmare from which she could wake up. But there was no going back. Emily was tired of being the only one to give in, the only one to care, the only one trying to keep the peace. There was no more room for submission or fear. She looked at James, who watched the scene with the serenity of someone who knew that justice was finally being served. He didn't need to say anything for her to feel even more firm in her decision. Michael stepped forward, trying to regain some of his composure. Emily, think about it. This is all going too far, he said, searching for the authoritative voice he always used to control her. But it no longer worked. She was no longer the woman who accepted crumbs of love and respect. What she did went too far, he countered. You tried to take everything from me, and now you're desperate because you couldn't. The truth was a blow he couldn't avoid. Patricia and Rachel were still trapped in their own despair, trying to understand how they had lost everything in the blink of an eye. Emily, however, felt a deep relief. It wasn't just about the house or the money. It was about getting back what had always been hers. Her dignity, her autonomy, her peace. The tension in the room was almost palpable. Patricia finally seemed to understand that there was no way out. And in a last act of desperation, she tried to reverse the situation with a sudden change of tone. Emily, my dear, I think we can resolve this another way. We've always been a family, haven't we? Her voice now carried a forced sweetness, a pathetic effort to manipulate the only person who still had power there. But Emily just watched her impassively. How many times had she heard similar words, always empty, always followed by humiliations disguised as innocent jokes? Now, all that seemed distant, irrelevant. You've never treated me like family, and honestly, it's better this way. Her words cut off any hope Patricia still had of escaping the consequences. James, who had been watching until then, decided to intervene. The papers are ready. You have 30 days to vacate the house. If you want to avoid an even more serious lawsuit, I suggest you leave quietly. His voice was calm, but it carried an unquestionable firmness. Michael ran his hands over his face, exhausted, while Rachel whispered something unintelligible, still in shock. Emily felt a twinge of satisfaction at seeing that, for the first time, they were experiencing firsthand what she had endured for years. It wasn't revenge. It was justice for the woman who had dedicated herself, who had been humiliated, who had been treated like a nuisance in her own home. Now, the tables had turned, and she had no intention of looking back. Patricia refused to accept defeat. Her eyes filled with hatred. She pointed an accusing finger at Emily. You always thought you were better than us, didn't you? Always so correct, so perfect. But you're going to end up alone, Emily. And when that happens, you'll regret turning your back on us. Her voice was shaking, but there was no longer the arrogance it had before. It was pure fear. The fear of losing the luxury, the comfort, the sense of power she had always had at the expense of others. But Emily felt nothing but indifference. That woman no longer had any power over her. I'd rather be alone than live surrounded by people who treat me like nothing, she replied, with devastating calm. And then, without waiting another second, she turned and walked away, leaving behind years of submission and suffering. Michael, who had been trying to maintain an air of control until then, finally broke down. He knew Emily wouldn't back down. He tried to grab her arm, but she pulled away before he could even touch her. It doesn't have to be this way, he whispered, almost pleading. Emily stared at him for a moment, but there was no more room for doubt or weakness. You made your choice, Michael, and now you're reaping what you sowed. He stood there unresponsive as she walked to the door with James at her side. For the first time, he seemed to truly see what he had lost. But it was too late. Leaving the mansion was one of the most symbolic moments for Emily. Each step she took felt lighter, as if she was finally getting rid of a weight she had been carrying for years. Inside, Patricia and Rachel argued among themselves, in complete despair, while Michael remained silent, staring at the floor. Emily didn't care anymore. The cold night breeze hit her face as she crossed the front door, and for the first time in a long time, she felt truly free. James looked at his sister with a mixture of pride and relief. You did what needed to be done, he said, as they walked to the car. Emily just nodded. There was still a long way to go, but she knew that she would never allow anyone to make her feel small inside her own home again. The next day, James's lawyers officially began the process of removing Michael's family from the mansion. The impact was immediate. The scandal spread quickly through Patricia's social circles. Her high society friends, who had always fawned over her, now avoided her, as if simply associating with her would tarnish their own reputations. Rachel, accustomed to a life of effortless luxury, found herself faced with the reality of having to find a way to support herself for the first time. Michael, whose career as an architect depended on maintaining a respectable image, began to lose clients. No one wanted to associate his name with someone involved in real estate fraud. What they had done to Emily was now backfiring on them like a domino effect, taking them down one by one. With the trial underway, Emily prepared herself for the moment that would truly end that cycle, the definitive removal of Michael's family from the mansion. A few weeks later, accompanied by the bailiffs, she watched as Patricia, Rachel, and Michael were forced to leave. The desperation in their eyes was evident. Rachel cried, screaming that she had nowhere to go, while Patricia maintained an expression of disbelief, as if she could not accept that everything she had ever lived for had come to an end. Michael, on the other hand, remained silent, perhaps already aware that there was nothing more he could do. Emily watched the scene without pleasure, but with the certainty that she was doing the right thing. It was not revenge. It was justice. The door closed behind them, and for the first time in years, the house was hers again. But it wasn't just a property. It was the place where she grew up, where her parents had dreamed of building a family with solid values, and where she could finally start over without having to shrink to fit into a space that had always been hers by right. As she walked through the now empty and silent hallways, Emily realized that this house needed a new life, a new purpose. She decided, right then and there, that she would transform the mansion into something bigger than just a home. A space open to preserve stories, to value what truly mattered. This place would never again be used to sustain arrogance, contempt, or selfishness. Over the next few months, Emily devoted herself entirely to renovating the mansion. It wasn't just about renovating the structure, but about reclaiming the meaning of the place. She hired historical preservation experts, researched details of the original architecture, and brought back elements that her parents had valued. Each choice she made was a step toward honoring her family and, at the same time, affirming her new phase of life. During this process, she realized that, for the first time in a long time, she was investing energy in something that truly made her happy. There were no more looks of contempt, unfair demands, or the constant feeling of being unwanted. The house, once a stage for humiliation, now became a symbol of her overcoming. Meanwhile, Michael, Patricia, and Rachel's lives were taking a completely different path. Without access to Emily's money, they were forced to face reality. Patricia lost her social influence, invitations to events disappeared, and the friends who had always been there disappeared without a trace. Rachel, without the luxury provided by her family, tried to maintain her position as an influencer, but without travel, expensive clothes, and ostentation, her audience quickly lost interest. Michael, with his reputation tarnished, saw his career collapse. The irony was obvious. They spent years trying to put Emily down, treating her as inferior, but in the end, it was they who lost everything. And the worst thing for them was not the bankruptcy, but the fact that they were now completely forgotten. On the day the mansion reopened as a historic preservation site, Emily stood at the entrance, watching the first people arrive. Former neighbors, researchers, architecture enthusiasts, and even strangers interested in the history of the place walked through the restored rooms, admiring the details she had worked so hard to save. She heard compliments, saw looks of fascination, and felt something she had not experienced there for a long time: belonging. It was no longer the house where she had suffered humiliation, where her value had been ignored. It was now a place of memory, of respect, of new beginnings. Emily realized that she had not only recovered her home, but also recovered herself. As she stepped out into the garden, she took a deep breath, feeling the cold Boston wind touch her face. She thought about everything she had been through: the pain, the anger, the struggle to get back on her feet. But above all, she thought about how that day symbolized the closing of a cycle. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel hatred. She just knew that she would never again allow anyone to diminish her, to make her feel less than she really was. The Emily who accepted crumbs was in the past. Now, she knew exactly what she was worth, and no one else would have the power to take it away from her.